Okay, today's speaker is Dr. Bruce Corrie, and he is a leading Twin Cities-based economist, business expert, cultural entrepreneur, and longtime member of the Concordia University St. Paul faculty. He currently serves on the board of the Opportunity and Growth Institute of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, as well as the Midway Chamber of Commerce, Union Park District Council, Junior Achievement, and the Minnesota Museum of American Art. He's a busy guy. Recently, Dr. Corrie served for a year as Director of Planning and Economic Development for the City of St. Paul, and continues to be a driving force for economic inclusion in the capital city and beyond. Dr. Corrie's work has garnered deep media coverage across local, ethnic, national, and international media. He has also published numerous academic articles and has written extensively for the St. Paul Pioneer Press and Minnesota Business Magazine. With a warm welcome on behalf of Humanist MN, I'll turn the Zoom room over to you now, Dr. Corrie.
Thank you, Audrey, and thank you, Harlan and Suzanne and Marcy and all the other people of members of Minnesota Humanists. It's an honor and pleasure to be here with you today and to engage with you on an important topic, and I welcome this opportunity. Audrey, you had asked me a question. I forgot to respond whether I'm okay with you taping it. I'm okay with you taping it. So I'm going to share with you some thoughts, and I'm going to share my screen first. I'm going to give you and share with you a summary of an engagement I recently had, which helped put thoughts together not only about me, but about the ALANA communities, African, Latino, Asian, and Native American communities of Minnesota, when the Minnesota House Select Committee on Racial Justice, co-chaired by Representative Ruth Richardson and Representative Rena Moran, they asked me to offer some thoughts on the economic costs of racism and what can we do about it. And so while thinking about that request, we offer the Minnesota solution. And you could find information, and I'll have the link later, but my website is empoweringstrategies.org, where you'll find a lot of my research and work of how we could, on the various research and materials that I have produced over the years, including this report that I'm going to be sharing with you, these thoughts that I'm going to share with you. So starting off like a good professor, because I am at Concordia University, a little about Concordia University. You may have seen it, the little university by the freeway on 94 in Lexington. But today, in the heart of this COVID crisis, we are a very healthy university with growing enrollment, and it didn't happen accidentally. We also have the most affordable private college tuition in the state. And recently Forbes magazine listed us as the one of the top universities, online programs in terms of return on investment. So I teach in the MBA program. I'm currently in an online program with the MBA students, and one of my classes I had a student from Indonesia, another one working in the army located out in Australia, and a group of a very diverse group. So it was fun to teach a group in this world. And so as we move to this online world, Concordia University is also well positioned because we've invested in building adult education and delivery platforms. So I share with you a little bit insight into the background of one of my hats. The other hat that I have is immersed in the community, out of which a lot of this research comes up. So, question to any of you, how large is the ALANA BIPOC economy? Anyone put anything in the chat that you might think is the correct answer?
Is this for the country?
For Minnesota.
Minnesota.
So I have St. Eric says 60 billion, you're right. That was my first estimate, just looking at economic assets like income and the number of businesses and the real estate, the residential real estate that the community owns. But when I added what I did for the current presentation with the Minnesota legislature, I added an estimate of the lifetime earnings of the graduate, of the people in the workforce. What is an estimate of their lifetime earnings? And that comes up, when I put all of this together, then the ALANA BIPOC economy becomes $1.4 trillion. So that is what is the image first I'd like to keep in your mind as we talk about this community and engage with this community. The ALANA community is a $1.4 trillion economy, and if by way of comparison, the economy of Mexico is an estimated 1.25 trillion. So you could see the magnitude of the potential that it offers to Minnesota. And so, as I mentioned to you, you can break it down by income, by businesses, by workforce. I haven't added the lifetime earnings of all the 500,000 youth in the schools and in the university systems. And if I do that, they represent another 1.5 trillion in lifetime earnings. So it's such a valuable resource, which Minnesota really has to wake up, because this asset, if all these young people achieve at least a bachelor's degree through the educational system, then their lifetime earnings is going to be $1.5 trillion, and Minnesota needs to be aware of it, especially when you have this big achievement gap. You heard in the newspaper, 40% of students currently during COVID are failing, and that's something that has to have a wake-up call. And this community puts about $3 billion in taxes, Minnesota taxes, every year, and so it's playing a very important role in this overall economy of Minnesota. And it also offers this global and cultural assets and networks that makes Minnesota a global state. So you may have heard about the Minnesota paradox, and this paradox was articulated by Dr. Samuel Myers out of the Humphrey Institute. And so he raised the issue is, how can we explain the fact that we have one of the highest quality of life, progressive politics, innovative programs, participatory government, and a diverse economy coexisting with some of the worst racial disparities, especially for Black Minnesotans? So that was the question that he had around how he articulated the Minnesota paradox. So tied to this paradox is the cost of the disparities. What is this economic cost of racism in Minnesota? So in the chat, what do you think is this cost of racism in terms of the local economy? Can anyone volunteer a guess among these three options? 100 million, a billion, 280 plus billion? So I'm seeing a billion, I'm seeing 280 plus, I'm seeing a billion, 100 million, so it's right across the board, right? So when I went into the details of looking at what's the cost of the housing gap, what's the cost of the entrepreneurship gap, what's the cost of the workforce gap, what's the cost of the lifetime earnings gap if everyone reached their potential in education similarly to the white population, right? And when I added it all up, it came up to around $280 billion. And again, if you look at it from the perspective of what does 280 billion mean, the economy of Chile is 280 billion, right? So that's the magnitude of the loss to the ALANA communities because of racial disparities. So you have a 287 billion hit that these communities have taken over the years. And the flip side of it, if you close the gap, Minnesota's economy would increase by 287 billion. And taxpayers, you'd get an extra $2 billion in tax payments every year that could go into investments in the state and what the states need. So there's a cost and implications of having that gap. And so the question is, what's the best way to address these racial disparities? What do we do about it? So you've seen many approaches. One approach is, well, let's be colorblind. Let's treat everybody the same way. Another approach is, let's be intentional and see racism where it appears so that we can be more effective in how we deal with this issue. And then there could be an approach of how do we, acknowledging where we are, transform us and move us to a higher level where everybody has the opportunity for achieving their full potential. And so, we could discuss about this, these different approaches. I recently had the opportunity to offer my perspective when I was looking at a discussion on what determines student success in retention rates in an academic institution. And when you look at this high-powered researcher narrow down these 4 or 5 big factors and say, you fix that and we fix the problem of retention. And so that's an example of a colorblind approach. It works for everyone. And my response for that is that's what is called a race-neutral approach. And that's the challenge, and that's the reason why we have the Minnesota paradox, the disparities, because we have to start seeing color. We have to start seeing why certain groups are behaving or experiencing an educational experience in a particular way. What is the way that teachers and institutional leaders engage and create an environment for success? And if you don't see how those institutions operate, we are not going to address the problem of retention, especially when we're dealing with the gap. And what I would encourage is the movement to move. It's good to be colorblind, to treat everybody equally, but we also have to understand the reality of our existence. And that will enable us to move to the next phase of transforming our system. And so some of the ideas that I'm proposing here are ideas to transform Minnesota with a racial perspective so that we can address some of the core challenges and opportunities that we face. So we call it the Minnesota solution because let me step back a little bit and say who the we is. Okay, so the crisis that hit our ALANA economies, again, why do I use the word ALANA and not BIPOC? You feel comfortable to use whatever you are comfortable with. The reason why I use the word ALANA, meaning African, Latino, Asian, and Native American, because it gives me a clear perspective on who I am referring to. I personally also do not like to be characterized as a person of color. I don't want my identity to be shaped by how I look, but I want my identity to be shaped by who I am and what I offer to this world. And so using ALANA in some ways addresses the BIPOC issue too, because it starts with African and ends with Native American. And we've got to be very conscious of the fact that these communities, especially Africans of descendants of slaves and Native Americans, they are the ones that are are the worst off in American society in terms of many of these outcomes. And we have got to be putting those communities at a top priority as we rebuild this country. So in the relationship to the challenge that we've been having around COVID, there's a triple crisis that hit us. We had the COVID that disproportionately has impacted the ALANA communities. We have the pandemic, which led to an economic decline, and that economic decline hit different sectors of the economy differently. People who had the ability to work from home, like you and I using these screens, versus people who had no choice. And some of them were essential workers, some of them were working in jobs that require them to be in present. And so again, the ALANA communities tended to be in those communities that were hit the hardest with the economic decline too, whether it's restaurants or the hospitality sector or the entertainment sector. And the third crisis was the civil unrest after the murder of George Floyd that again destroyed a number of their assets. And currently right now, the economic progress that has been achieved by that community, I believe is being pushed back at least a decade. And so we've got to do something about it. So we've launched the ALANA Community Brain Trust. That means a group of people who say, here are the talents we have to offer, especially in the area of two big needs, and that is capital, when we talk about the economy, access to capital, and then the second one is capacity. How do we build capacity? And the third area is around connections and how do we network. So some of these ideas, these ideas are built around from the ALANA Community Brain Trust, and our solution is rooted deep in who Minnesota is and what people in this community value. And you could see that sharing is very deep roots in Minnesota, and welcoming and building the common goods. We see a sustainability very strong in Minnesota, the connection to the earth, as well as the importance to have sustainable institutions and organizations. And then we want prosperity for all. We want prosperity for the ALANA communities, but we also realize there are low-income communities that are also negatively impacted, and we've got to do it together. We've got to have shared sustainable prosperity for all. Now, as I speak, I cannot see the chat and I can't hear questions. So Audrey, if you think I need to be interrupted and you have a question or clarification, feel free to do so. But I can't monitor the chat as I'm speaking here. So.
Sure, I'll do that.
Okay.
I'll monitor the chat, but we'll see if we can let you speak and then go to questions later.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Yeah, so there are 5 elements of the solution that we offer. First is view this, one of the interesting components, and here's my experience. For about 20 years, I've been talking about these economic contributions of immigrants and minorities, quantifying their impact, like I'm doing right now, 1.4 trillion. Doing studies on people of Mexican origin, people of Liberian origin, Asians, Black community, African immigrants, and you see volumes of these studies I've done over the years to show that the deficit mentality that I first found in Minnesota in 1987 when I came here is a wrong one, that we've got to change our perceptions by looking at people as assets. Especially, and then it puzzled me that the people in the room that would lighten up and feel affirmed when they hear an economist from an academic institution affirm their value that they bring to the community I often see people's faces and spirits light up, people from the ALANA communities. But it's not necessarily the same from the other communities. And it puzzled me, especially when I dealt with high-ranking officials, where when they would come for a meeting to a community, some of them, I would send them this data ahead of time and say, it'd be good if you mentioned that the value that these communities bring to Minnesota, but they would never do it. And I would puzzle the heck out of me. Why would they not even acknowledge value? Till I thought about it, and I said, and to deny someone's value is the basis of exploitation. That when you deny their value, then you could disregard and treat them as objects and exploit them, and that would be one way that I would interpret this data. And so it's also very unusual that someone from a small university like where I'm at Concordia produces these kinds of data, but you have high-powered statisticians and research institutions that fail to even document the vibrant growth of ALANA firms in Minnesota and how they are adding to the wealth. So when I ask to view ALANA communities as a 1.4 trillion asset, I'm asking to change that mentality of people, that when you look at someone on the road and as you come by and straight away classify them as in color and straight away classify that as someone below you, that could be that has to change. But when you operate from a position of affirmation of assets, automatically you'll find it'll unleash a tremendous amount of energy, because you're freeing people to be the most creative, the most innovative, and that's the future. The other elements is that we need to put people, and I know that some of the things resonate with Minnesota humanist values, because I've read some of it as I was invited to speak here, putting people at the center of all economic development efforts, to operate with cultural intelligence. If you're looking at the elections, they're saying, okay, how come certain sections of the Latino community voted one way, or certain section of the Asian community voted one way? Well, these communities are all diverse, and we need to look and understand them because they're coming from different angles, especially if you are in a policymaker and you want people to engage or to use or to follow. You've got to have that language and other accessibilities and operate with cultural intelligence. Then you need to empower individuals to effectively engage with their social, economic, institutional, and personal environment, because ultimately people have to be the creators of their own destiny. People have to be empowered to change their own destiny. And my early research in the state of Kerala in India shows how this plays out when people are empowered to change their own destiny. And finally, there's no excusing from the fact that we need sustained investments, especially in the economic development infrastructure. And as I share these slides and these ideas, I want you to think about your own framework in which you look at the world. What I'm offering is you have a statement on racism and institutional racism. What I'm offering is something concrete, a concrete way, if you want to change it, how could you start building wealth and economic development assets in the community? Because that's going to be the long-term solution to racism. So we need a comprehensive kind of a strategy, because very often people say, how can I help them? What could I do? Well, we have to have a portfolio of services and programs. Give people a fish, teach them how to fish, build their capacity to fish and the capacity of institutions that serve them to fish. Provide a place for them to fish. It's no use to having to know how to fish where I can't practice. So that's where the structural change comes in, providing a place to fish. But you got to make it deeper and say, how could we also develop avenues for innovation and creativity where people can develop a new fish and finally transform the fishing industry in new ways? So when you look at an audit of a portfolio of services offered to whether it's the ALANA communities or the state in general, you'll know how effective it's going to be. If you're just focusing on giving a fish or just focusing on teaching how to fish, it's going to be a very short-lived scenario. So I'm going to delve deep into this issue about investments and what we could do to invest in the communities. So here's my concept for you to think about. It's what I mean by an economic development infrastructure. Wouldn't it be great in every community or neighborhood, people have the access to this basic wealth building infrastructure? So there could be business incubators like Mercado Central, where small businesses, or the Mungtown Village or Hmong Village, where you have small businesses, larger businesses set up so that they can they can grow in a low-cost space, a job board that connects them to jobs, business-to-business networks, a land trust. A land trust is when the community buys the land, and so whatever is built on it can have lower rents because you don't have to figure in the cost of land into that rent that's ultimately going to be charged. And the picture out there is a commercial land trust on Selby Avenue, Golden Time Cafe. If you know about it, there are 2 buildings there. The land is owned by Rondo Land Trust, and the buildings and the people who live there now have affordable rent because of the lower cost because of that. Then we need financial asset building tools like different kinds of savings and loan, savings and investment assets. Equity fund, people want loans, but today especially, they need what is called patient capital, grants and equity investments in their businesses, and that it'll take, don't have to pay it right away, but you can pay it when your business makes money and you can return it. You need organizations, they call community development corporations, community development financial institutions. That's the CDCs and the CDFIs. These are organizations like the MEDA and Neighborhood Development Center and groups like that that are trained to help businesses succeed. And alternative forms of wealth creation like co-op housing, rent to own opportunities. But we also need to remember that health and education, and so a community health clinic and wellness center accessible to everyone, and emergency, like we are finding today, the need for emergency shelter, food and energy, like you are encouraging that food drive. But communities need to have that capacity to serve their neighbors around them, and it's a very weak infrastructure that we have right now. I also offered to the legislature some research that I did, and so every 10 years, you know, we have redistricting. And so last 2 rounds, we went before the legislature and said, who's representing these economic interests of ALANA communities, down by legislative districts, the economic power, and we said, who's going to represent this? In the last redistricting, we got a little bit more sophisticated. We actually drew our own redistricting map and said, what happens when the chickens draw the map and not the fox? Right now, the redistricting maps have been drawn by the fox. So the chickens have no chance. So what happens if we flip it? So we drew maps based on the preserving ALANA economic interest and respecting every principle in a redistricting map. And it was very interesting how legislative districts could change. And one of the fundamental insights I got was a lot of legislators have received their power at the expense of the ALANA communities when the communities have been broken up into districts because somebody else has set the framework. So we offered our map to the judicial panel that ultimately drew the districts of the state and said, we want you to find ways to represent these interests. And when they did draw their maps, I personally found that was a better representation than than what we suggested in terms of the numbers and districts. And some of the successes you're seeing is because how those districts were drawn. And there was also some evidence to show that the judges did take our considerations into our input into consideration. It's a very important point because I want to make is that because today there are about 125 legislative districts with at least $100 million in ALANA economic interest in their district. And I want to make the point that between our testimony and the map that was drawn, that we had a stake in how it was drawn. And so it's not only legally important, but also morally and ethically important that these legislators who have these economic interests in these districts have to work to build the economic base of the ALANA communities. And so I've identified these 125 legislative districts, and between them, they have the votes, regardless of political parties, to pass any legislation. So if these long-term interests are not done, we know that these legislators have not done what they have been charged to do, represent the economic interest of people living in their districts. And I would suggest would be an important basis for recalling them. But elections have their ways too. I noticed in one legislative district currently, a legislature that represents about 200 million in ALANA economic interest lost his seat. So it will come back to haunt them if they don't. So how could we implement these ideas? Well, we have a system in place in Minnesota to get this done. I'm not going to go into the details about this because it's getting too much in the weeds. So I'm just going to give it high level, but I mentioned some of these details to the legislators, how we could, there are a lot of, I shared with them, there are 3 buckets if you want to do something. The first bucket is things that cost no money. You don't have to spend any money, but you can achieve a lot. The second, where you need to invest. And the third is emergency. Right now, if we want to stabilize these communities, you've got to do something right now. So in the first bucket about things that don't cost any money, here's examples. We have billions of dollars that the state has deposited in banks. So why can't the state ask the banks, partner with the ALANA communities and make sure that there's adequate capital invested in these communities, that discrimination in lending, or if just because they don't have a relationship with the banker, should not be a reason why they can't access money. The state also has billions of dollars of retirement money investment, and they invested. They invested in stocks, they invested in assets, but they all can also be invested in investment opportunities. So can we create an investment note? For example, this investment note will say, we are building an affordable housing unit, we are building a business mixed use development, which is based on a land trust. It's going to generate X% interest. Why don't you invest in that? Because you get repayment of that note. Why not? We can also have the state take some of its assets. Suppose it takes the land that the state owns, or some portion of it, or the revenue that it gets from some portion, some activity, and guarantee a $25 million loan pool that banks now, but they have someone watching their bank, can take the step to understand the ALANA communities and invest in these communities. And so a banker told me that, hey, when the PPP time, when DEED offered, the State Development Agency offered them a loan guarantee, it freed them and they went out and started lending money free for all, and they're not losing money there. Well, we can leverage what we have. We can leverage public spending. This is another very sad story of Minnesota. Governor Jesse Ventura appointed me to chair the governor's working group on minority business development. So you know it's history, 2000. So I looked And I found that among all the billions that the state is spending, billions with a B, less than 2% or 1% went to businesses owned by the ALANA communities. Today, if I look, the statistics have not changed. That's a shame, because the state has an opportunity of using the spending to use businesses from these communities to grow. And if it's not doing it, someone has to be held accountable. So how can we leverage public spending? What are those rules and regulations that are not serving the typical ALANA businesses, even if there is about 183,000 in sales compared to a 1.4 million of a white business? So if you have rules and regulation of what the small business has to do, you're going to not have, that business is going to go under. And I'm not talking about safety rules. I'm talking about rules like this is how you should operate certain labor kinds of requirements, or you should offer certain bond kinds of requirements, and not figure out a way to exempt businesses below a particular range level so that they can grow. And once they are healthy, then you can impose all those rules and regulations of a healthy, mature business. So how do we leverage public spending? How do we leverage Congress? And one of the things that the ALANA Brain Trust was doing, we were engaging with the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis and the Federal Reserve Bank system, and says, hey, the Federal Reserve Bank is the lender of the last resort. The Federal Reserve Bank also has stepped out and started bailing out, buying the debt of corporations, like these big corporations. Why can't the Federal Reserve Bank be the lender of the last community resort? Why can't you buy the ALANA investment note like you're buying the corporate debt? Why can't you create and expand existing facilities in order to make sure that there's enough access to capital? And the Federal Reserve Bank, the response has been they are bound by statutory reasons, and so we need to change it. And so why don't we leverage our congressional delegation to change the statutory requirements? And incidentally, in Congress, there's a Senate file, I think it's called the Jobs and Neighborhood Investment Act. Senator Warner is leading it, but Senator Warner is also working with a group of people that includes currently, it was Senator Harris, now Vice President-elect Harris, where they have this piece that we've been talking about with the Fed in that bill. So it could happen, and if those kinds of things happen, the ALANA Brain Trust wants to be ready to be able to help our communities access those things. Small Business Administration, you heard about the PPP loans and the massive failure of what it failed to reach the ALANA communities, and I have data and research to show it, because it was never meant for them, yet those businesses are hurting. The housing HUD, they have a very interesting rule called Section 3, that when you do all these housing projects, make sure you include public housing residents, workforce, and workers and businesses, low-income people and neighborhood businesses. That rule has never been enforced or monitored. When we ask the state, give us the data on Section 3, we're finding is nobody's listening to it. The CDFI fund is another investment fund. So, and then the big idea about establish $1 billion investment fund that will fund all these activities. And where would you get the money? I want to leave with this maps, and you have seen these maps. These are these infamous redlining maps of Minneapolis, St. Paul, Rochester, Duluth, places in Minnesota where ALANA communities were deliberately disenfranchised in economic sense. So when you talk about the economic chokehold that has created this economic gap, that can be seen very vividly in these areas where the wealth capacity of these communities have been really depleted and historically had a ban. So my suggestion, I know I would have a lot of opposition from the real estate industry, but if you want to fix the problem, start with what caused the problem and put a 1% tax, just a 1% tax on any real estate transaction over $500,000, say over 400,000. Any transaction, put a tax, there'll be enough money generated every month, every year to pay off that bond over 10 years or 20 years that we could have out there. So that's my big picture, and you could find, as I said, my work on empoweringstrategies.org, or shoot me an email and be happy to talk as needed. So that's it. Keep open for questions or clarification or anything that's.
Well, thank you, Dr. Corrie. I think, Harlan, if you're there, you can start the Q&A, but we do have 2 questions in the chat that I'll start with, and then Harlan can take over if I find him there. I think you're there somewhere, Harlan. Anyway, so 2 questions. The first one is from Mark, and he says, you note that the ALANA community's assets to Minnesota as valuing as 1.4 trillion. What % of the Minnesota asset of all communities do you consider that to be? So what percentage of the whole sort of Minnesota asset?
Good question. I'll answer that, but I thought I'll answer the one I saw in the chat first. And for that, I'm going to put my screen up so you'll see my screensaver, right? It says, how about changing hearts and minds, right?
Right.
And I think when you look at this, the people that have influenced my thinking, people like Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela and Dr. Martin Luther King and Paulo Freire and Mother Teresa. This is the hearts and minds as well as deep. So you not only have to have personal liberation, without that it's not going to work, but you also have economic liberation, political liberation, social liberation. You got to change the entire structures in order for it to work, for it to happen. Now, coming to your question about percentage, I haven't gone through that calculation because that's something that changes the narrative, but I would say that in terms of percentage of the population and percentage of wealth, because of these huge gaps that I've identified to be 282 billion, right? There will be, it'll be much lower. So if someone else has to go and estimate what is the wealth of all the other communities and do all that stuff, my argument is very focused. I'm giving you an asset base of 1.4 trillion. How are you investing and growing it? And why is there a gap in this of $287 billion? Why can't we fix it? That's my focus.
And I want to ask one question for clarification, and then Harlan, are you ready to take over then?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so my one question is, you made reference to this brain trust, and
Yeah, brain trust.
Could you explain a little bit more? Who is this brain trust?
So
what is it?
Yeah. So brain trust is a group of individuals and organizations that are coming together to address these 2 big issues: capital, capacity, and then making a network. So currently, we are building it as we move. 3 of us are serving as coordinators. Myself, and my affiliation would be this empoweringstrategies.org. Brett Buckner with a group that I'm also connected with called 1mn.org. This has been around about 10 years or more. It's actually even further because it was known as something else earlier. It evolved. It's a multi-ethnic, non-partisan platform for policy issues. And then Jane Leonard from Growth and Justice, which is a broad-based group focusing on equity and has the economic blueprint. And then we've given an invite out to our ALANA communities, if you have a skill of how do you make a land trust, if you know how to make that investment note that we talked about, if you know how to construct a business incubator, let us know. We're going to keep a list. So we have a roster right now, about 40 people with different skills. And then we have a roster currently about 20, maybe more than that, 50 or so of people that say we like to be engaged as needed. So I'll give you an example of how this activates. So we were approached by the Department of Public Safety to say, can you get the word out? We have got $8 million of CARES funding that's going targeted to youth during COVID. Can you get the word out so people in the base can know about it and apply for it? So we activated in less than a week a statewide network of people and said, hey, this coming, apply. And if you need help in applying, let us know. And so of what I've heard, I haven't seen the list, but what I've heard from the people I talked to, about 600,000 went through statewide to organizations serving youth through this network. But we also offered a program for youth that will take them for a 5-week program that will give them financial literacy, give them a stipend, and then ask them to work on an idea to build their community. And I'm really inspired. We got right now over 100 youth from about maybe more than 20 cities and about 40 schools in this network. And on a Zoom screen like this, we bring them in, they're talking. But what I'm trying to say is this network is highly leveraged. To get those 100 plus youth from 40 school districts and all that stuff, it's not easy, but we have that ability. So it is an embryonic, organic network with people with expertise that could be mobilized and leveraged depending upon the ask and the need that we have to address. And it's open to people who want to connect with us. And so we don't really have a website right now as such, but we are meeting through an email network, and we are engaged very actively with our congressional delegation, with leaders around these ideas. And so, as you say, I presented to the Minnesota House Select Committee on Racial Justice to talk about some of these ideas. And some of these ideas come out from the testimony that people from the network provided to the legislature too.
Thank you. Harlan, you continue.
Okay, thank you, Audrey. And thank you so much, Dr. Corrie. It was really a very enlightening discussion. And if I could start off with a question of my own, then we're going to go to Christine and then say it to Eric. You mentioned the PPP Payment Protection Program. That didn't quite provide enough resources to the community, or the ALANA community. Can you tell us more about that? Why that happened?
So here's again the birth of the ALANA Brain Trust too. As soon as COVID hit, I realized what was happening. I launched a blog called COVID Economics and started putting issues of how COVID was intersecting with race, and then PPP was launched. And because of my experience with minority businesses, I realized that it's not going to work well because, first of all, most of them don't have access to bankers, and second of all, the system is geared towards a more healthier demographic of businesses. And right enough, you saw the first round of these loans came up, forgivable loans. If anybody doesn't know what PPP is, a forgivable loan that's given to business. The money vanished in a few days. Nothing happened. So my blog, I kept sending notes to the district administrator of the SBA and others. This needs to be fixed. So one day, they freed the PPP loan program for a few hours on a Wednesday, I remember. On a few hours, they opened it up only for small lenders. And these are the small lenders, could be these organizations that serve ALANA businesses like African Economic Development Solutions, MEDA, neighborhood development centers. And I know it for a fact because I was connected to 10 businesses when PPP was out. I sent them a note, say, apply. They couldn't get to the door. That evening, I called them, we called them. They had all the paperwork ready because they were applying and they were rejected. All of them got in that door that evening. They got the loan. Why did it happen? Because we created a space to fish, right? And because we created a space to fish, some of them got it. So it took that amount of energy to get that money to them. But still today, they haven't fixed it. We are telling them, take a chunk of that PPP money and make it dedicated to micro businesses. Make it dedicated to community-based organizations that are tight. It's like hitting your head. It looks like we're operating in two worlds. The world of a policymaker is the world of people who live in so-called like a downtown. They're in a whole universe that they have no idea about the work life of people on the streets, the business on the avenue. And as a result, it's incapable of them to even figure out how to fix it. Either that or they're not interested in them. So we kind of have continued to put pressure on them. And so when I did the analysis after all the money was spent, they were not asked to report race, but those who did, there was a universe of firms. And out of that, there were only 900 ALANA businesses that got the loans. Then I looked a little bit around them. And now I found a list of banks who lent to them. And that's the banks I'm reaching out to say, can you join us on a banking alliance to how we can use this in the past. So anyway, that's my experience with PPP.
Okay. Christine.
Well, actually, Harlan, your question touches on something that I was wondering about, so I'll go with that and another point. I heard that, yes, BIPOC, ALANA businesses were not getting access to this for some reason about their financing. And I guess I didn't quite follow. What aspect, and then I'll ask my other question after you have a chance to expand, what aspect did not help the business get in the door? Is it they just operate through the maybe smaller banking groups, that they just don't have the access or attention of those that are processing things? Can you expand on that a little?
So one way to answer that question is, if you want to look like a standard business that we want to think about, a business that has its own marketing department, its own HR department, its own, right? You have to be a business at least 3 to 5 million in size, because you can afford to have those functions. If you're a business, say in the Hmong Town or the Somali Souk or on many neighborhood stores, you're not there. You don't have a HR department. You don't have even a proper accounting system. Now, when PPP came in, it says we need X, Y, and Z kind of paperwork to be put in the system. So normally in times where we didn't have COVID, one of these nonprofits could go to the person, knock on the door, sit down, finish the paperwork, put it in. They couldn't do it this time. So the paperwork was not coming in. The people didn't have their documents together. That's what we call capacity. We need to increase the capacity of the businesses to even connect with the system, right? Mm-hmm. And then on the other side, the businesses, the organizations that were serving them, where you had two people, so let's say Hmong American Partnership or Latino Economic Development, one organization's needing to serve this huge market, even of the Hmong community or the Latino community. How in the world are you going to be able to do that with 2 staff or 1 staff, right? So the capacity issue is a big one. And so, but if you notice, the ones who were healthy, had access to a banker, they got in. They got their thing in. So you have a combination of factors, and again, it differs by community. African Americans face the biggest barriers. Most of their loans came via nonprofit sectors. and other communities like the Asians and Latinos managed to get a wider range of banks because they lived in small towns or somewhere. So it's a big challenge, and that's what the launch of this Bankers Alliance is, can we create a system to build those relationships and get things going.
Thank you. And thank you so much for your efforts on all this. And here's the other question I had, which maybe is just a quick number. Of course, you have lots of thoughts and you probably can't answer briefly, but I love all the information you're giving. As you were talking about what tapping into and building up and what the addition to the economy would occur, the 280 billion, if there was more support in education, et cetera. What also occurred to me is there's a lot of money spent from our tax dollars because some of these things are not possible. We have healthcare funding from the state and counties. We have housing support. We have income support. I wonder if you know or have calculated how much that takes money that could be used somewhere else in some other way. Do you have any idea of the size of that?
No, but
Okay.
yeah, I think it's captured in some ways in these other numbers, but you would just think about that. That's true, and one way might be to do it is to some kind of simulation that might come up with an answer.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, Santa Eric, you had a question?
Yeah, hi, thanks. First, I wanted to say thank you for the language that you used with ALANA and explaining your preference to using ALANA over BIPOC. I wanted to ask you a question about value measurements beyond the counting of dollars. I think that we need to think about trust, integrity, compassion, empathy, living in right relation to the earth, appreciation of beauty, and some of these other things like health and community experiences. We need to figure out ways to count these things. I've been pushing FAFSA and GAFSA, the Financial Accounting Standards group and the Government Accounting Standards groups, to try and think of ways, now that we have all this new data collection methods, to think of ways to count parts of our human interactions and human relations in ways that go beyond just counting of dollars. I really appreciate the experience that you talk about with the CDCs and CDFIs and neighborhood community land trusts and having cooperative ownership and different types of financial systems that will allow for a broadening of spreading of the wealth. But we need to even talk about different ways of counting wealth, because having just dollars be the measurement is something that allows for a lot of misinterpretation and misidentification of what really is important. Just as an example, you use that great hexagonal fish analysis. I would add a seventh, and we need to include the fish in our discussions.
Yeah, that's a good, yeah, true. Yeah, you're right. You brought back memories of my early days in graduate school. My thesis director was a person named Dennis Goulet, and he was somebody who was integrating the ethics of development. But at Notre Dame, we were talking about it, and part of my research was the challenge I faced. I was trying to show the economic impact of what's the economic impact of economic policies on children and poverty. And I was trying, and my challenge was to include political mobilization and things like you talked about into a quantitative analysis to prove a point, because the powers that be wanted proven in an economic functional form, but you can't, because there's methodological and all these issues. So you're right. There has to be some ways, and that's why in my framework I integrate the personal liberation component of it, because we have to move beyond having to being to, and I think those elements we have to figure out some ways to talk about it. So in the current COVID crisis, for instance, mental health and mental wellness is a huge cost that's unfairly being disproportionately borne by ALANA communities. And it's not given as much attention as it needs to.
Okay. If other people have questions, please, I'm going to call on Jerry, but you could also put it on the, by participants, I believe it's called. There's an option to raise your hand. Jerry.
Yeah, several months ago, I led a discussion. This is one of our repeating things, discussion and debate, D squared. I led a discussion on the reparations movement. Some of the people here may have attended that. And we talked about reparations, which has been proposed primarily for the African-American community. And a lot of what you're talking about seems to overlap with proposals in that regard. And I'm wondering, how do you view the reparations movement? How do you position your proposals vis-a-vis reparations? Should this be looked at as a way of doing reparations? Do you welcome or value that kind of association, or would you instead prefer to separate your proposals from kind of a reparations agenda?
Great question, Jerry. And I think I guess we get caught up in names and terms, and beyond that, it carries with it connotations and implications. There is a tremendous cost that has been borne by the African descendants of slaves, as people are calling themselves, ADOS, and Native Americans, and things like redlining have been documented now. So I would say there's a big case to do something, and we got to figure out a way to do it. And where I would zero in is a tax nationally, a tax on every financial transaction on the stock market, in the hedge funds and derivatives. This is not going to hurt anybody, but these people are speculating so much. You put a tax on that, that money goes into a fund that invests in the Black and Native American communities for sure. There are other communities too. The undocumented worker has been another very tragic story of people who have given so much to our country and our state, but treated with the most disrespect and having to live often in fear. So investment in those communities too, that is a important step.
Thank you. There's a question in chat from Dave Gill. I'll read it to you. What role does the reduction in the inheritance tax in previous decades play in the economic position of people of color?
Yeah, it's a good point, and it's tied to the redlining. Even recent research shows housing appraisals, tax assessments. They're finding statistically that seemingly even today in two different locations, the ALANA house is paying a higher tax or getting assessed at a lower level. So it's happening today too, and I guess it goes back to my initial conversation about seeing color and being colorblind and things like that, because a lot of people, it goes back to also my earlier question about people not responding to the number that I talk about, economic contributions. Part of the explanation is that it's not their reality, so they don't understand it, right? And so a lot of people don't really understand the privilege, what we call it white privilege, in this particular context, of what privilege you get because of your race and your position or your location versus someone who didn't have that. And it's not easy to see, and it's not easy to put yourself on the other person's shoe, and that's what people have got this benefit by virtue, and they've looked at GI Bill people, ALANA GIs and white GIs, and kinds of houses they end up with and the neighborhoods they ended up with. So you can document all of that. So there's a trace, there's a link, and I think what's politically the problem, going back to the reparation things, is people today are very unlikely to say, I'm going to pay this price. usually the response is, it's not, I didn't do it. My ancestors did it, but why should I suffer? So we got to find out some mechanism like this taxes on derivatives and stuff that can be more neutral in their mind, but serving an important role.
I noticed there's another question in chat. Audrey, maybe you could help me. Mark Tosin, did you read his question? Anybody know?
I think we already covered his question.
Okay.
But I see Marcy has a question, and then I have a couple of questions too.
Okay, we'll go Marcy and then Audrey.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Corrie. I have a question. You mentioned that you have been briefing the Minnesota legislature and perhaps congressional legislators for a while. And I'm wondering if there's any distinction in the reception you've gotten or any change from legislators that are in the Twin Cities, the metro area versus outstate. I know outstate demographics are changing a lot now, but do you have any observations about that, or what is your reception from legislators in different parts of the state?
That's a good question, and in the past, it's been tough to communicate, to get support from other people out state, but also political parties. But I'm beginning to see a movement nationally and probably locally. The kind of portfolio of policies we are recommending can fit well within both parties' political frameworks, like around wealth building. And I say it because the bills that we encourage, like we encourage Senator Tina Smith, could you sign on to that Neighborhood Job and Investment Act? And when you go and look in the website, you see that there are a lot of Republicans that have signed on to that bill in Congress too, the Congress version. So, I see some hope that people will find a place. It's going to be tough because of people are going to be focused now on the deficit, and we can't spend because of deficit. But what I've just suggested, I have a whole bucket that doesn't cost any money. Now, if you don't even do that, then I'm suspicious of what you're saying about deficit.
Thank you.
Audrey?
Yeah, I don't know if the work that you're doing at the Fed, Minneapolis Fed, on the Opportunity and Growth Institute is similar to the president of the Fed, Minneapolis Fed, Kashkari, President Kashkari. He's got this, or helped initiate this discussion around race and economics within the Federal Reserve System. I don't know if you're aware of that. But in joint, you mentioned a couple of bill at the national level, federal level. You were reporting to people here in the state. Do you see any legislation that's being promoted that needs some advocates like us? So that's one question. So what's happening on the legislative level here in the state in particular that maybe we could get behind? But secondly, maybe address, we're just ordinary citizens, but is there something that we can do besides on the advocacy to support the ALANA community?
Yeah, thank you for the offer to help. And I think that's a reason why I'm here too, is to build relationships and connect with you all. Because as we go forward, we can find ways to partner around advocacy. Like it's going to be a tough haul through the legislative session, and so we'll need to rally support around some of these ideas too. And what can we do? I think at a personal level, I think the personal level would be first being welcoming and being that openness to people. Goes a long way. That smile, the hospitality of someone that's different or new that you're engaging does a lot. And then we also can, we need to build our cultural intelligence of relating to different communities and establishing relationships, connecting with folks over time so that trust is built. and then lending support like you are doing to these larger changes. Very often people don't understand what systemic change is, what institutional change is. And the example I'm giving about the Federal Reserve Bank, it's an institution protecting financial interests. And when we're coming to talk to them about community, it's not in their ballpark and they don't have the brain to think about it. But that's where those institutions need to change in order for them to be more effective. Even for an academic institution like a university, how it operates and how it deals. People don't understand that. And very often it's a function of critical mass. So if I'm the only one in the room talking about it and nobody else understands what I'm saying because of their experience, then it's going nowhere. It's frustrating. So how do we build critical mass in leadership boards and organizations so then these conversations are easier to implement?
So just to be clear, do you see any, because there you were presenting in front of one of the committees at the state legislature, is there any specific legislation or action that you wanted them to take and that we could get behind?
Yeah, I respect the two co-chairs, Representative Rena Moran and Representative Ruth Richardson. They're currently contemplating recommendation. So yesterday they had me back again to talk about what are some of the recommendations that could be implemented, and what I presented here were some things that can be done. The state has a statute called Section 16C that says 25% of all state spending should go to small businesses. What I'm asking them is carve out 15% should go to ALANA businesses. So it's a very intentional, specific thing. The state has a huge legacy fund that goes towards the arts spending. I said carve out 15% because we've been involved, and I've been personally involved with a new strategy of economic development around cultural assets. So you may have heard about Little Mekong and Rondo and District del Sol, but those artists and art organizations don't get enough funding. So how do you get them so that they can infuse and have a different strategy of economic development? 2% of all construction, new construction projects have to be spent on art. Can we carve out some of that? So those are some of the ideas I've proposed to them. The state deposits. Why in the world can't you talk to the banks who have these institutions and say, hey, can we have you have our money, you have billions in deposits, you're making money out of it. Can't we do it a little differently? So those are things that don't cost money that can be done, and that's the support I think we should go to them. That there's one person who can do it by executive order, the governor. Why is the governor not doing it? Right? So can we ask him, can you be the leader of this 1.4 trillion asset and call the banks to the table? I know when I was in the city of St. Paul, I was looking at some of these things like the city's deposits and seen some models that we could work and some that had some potential.
So I'm just one more follow-up question, because I really want to, dive down, like, how can we really be helpful? Are there other nonprofit groups or other groups that you're associated with that we could together put pressure on, or you can put us in connection with, or initiatives that you're leading that we can just be another name and another group of people that are saying, yes, we care about this?
Great. I mean, I'm good to know that, because we keep you connected to the work of the Brain Trust, and then find these opportunities and talents and skills that people can bring to some of the things that we are doing. And for sure, I think we'll keep connected, and that would be the opportunity where certain things that, some doors that need to be open could be open. And I think, I'm not sure whether it's obvious in what I've been saying, but our approach is a multiracial approach too. That includes even people, ALANA communities, but even the white community. people who align with what we are doing, because I think the future, that's where the shared sustainable prosperity happens. It can't be one group doing things and another group, but can we do it together, integrated, and create a place that works for everyone. So that's where we welcome the partnerships from your organization and explore what is doable.
Great. Let's stay in touch then.
Yeah, for sure.
I think Suzanne had a question.
Hi,
Suzanne?
yes, I have a question. You mentioned redistricting early on in your presentation, and we have another redistricting effort coming up. Is this something that you're going to be involved in? And I'm kind of curious, so that, since I don't know exactly how redistricting gets done, like what specific things might you be looking for throughout the state?
You're right. Brett Buckner, who is one of our colleagues, he is the redistricting guru. And we are beginning to talk about, as I said, last time we got someone to draw a map using all the, so yeah, we'd like to align around. I think for Minnesota, the best, if there was one principle we were to promote, is make competitive districts, more competitive districts. Because when you have these legislators having both at them, they're going to come to compromise easy and get solutions. And those are the ones that I personally think is a solution. So for sure, I connect you with that, and happy to see the ways we can do that. I also noticed a question in the chat about women-owned businesses, and so I wanted to share an experience of the African immigrant study that we did. I found that there was a higher in entrepreneurship sentiment among females than males, and they faced very unique challenges compared to the males in people understanding their product or accessing capital. And we went right after that study to the legislature to fund a female-oriented, a female-focused economic development initiative that the legislature had the data but didn't have the will to invest. But entrepreneurship among females, very strong, and it is an area, and again, ALANA females facing both within groups and across some unique issues, but a tremendous amount of talent that is untapped. And so I think we have, and then the micro lending program comment that you mentioned, Senator, I really, most of the businesses are small. So a lot of the needs of the businesses are under 25,000, under 100,000 in terms of a lot of the small businesses that are trying to move up, and they can't even get that. So having a focus on micro business. So I happened to get involved indirectly in the last legislative session, where I kind of pushed this concept of micro business. And so some of the legislation that came had a micro business carve out. The roots of that conversation can be traced to Senator Fong He on the east side, and he and I talked about integrating that micro business in it, because you can't just say businesses less than 20 employees. There's going to be all the businesses there. You got to have an income as well as an employment frame to locate these very tiny businesses that need help.
Dr. Christine, did you have another question?
Yes, first I'll just heartily echo what Audrey said about aligning with what you're working on, and let's be a voice at the Capitol. And one thing I thought of, I think you're operating on a different angle of creating more equitable outcomes. We're also our partners and members of Minnesota Second Chance Coalition, which is, the focus is related to those who have been incarcerated, but an ally of theirs at their Capitol Day on the Hill last year was somebody who was an organization, something about financial not security, but just wise financial practices is about the things that more on a micro level. Your programs are more macro level or just bigger. Stop taking away people's driver's licenses when they have fines. Well, how does that help them financially? My goodness. So I didn't know if you know of that group or just, commenting that there's a range of angles and it just takes many people working on many different angles, and I really applaud what you're working on. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you there. One of my students was in that case and was in prison, and I got a call on a fine. He got into prison and all that stuff. But I was thinking, Audrey, about your question, how can we help? Here's one very concrete way, and what Christine, you were talking to. If you have relationships with a bank or a bank leadership, and we are launching this Bankers Alliance, ALANA Bankers Alliance. So if you have some relationship with a bank or a financial institution, and help us connect, and what we are asking the banks, 4 things. What we want to do and some metrics to judge it. One, personal relationship with the banker. Can you have a goal among your clients that you're going to do a special outreach so that your customers from the ALANA communities get to know your bankers? Second, can you partner with us and we can figure out some risk-sharing deals to get more loans out to not only businesses but also big projects. Then we are asking them what we can also provide to them. We can help them with cultural intelligence, and I give them the example with the civil unrest. An African immigrant group, AEDS, got some money from donations, and they put together a group of advisors on how to give the money out. And they invited me to be part of it, and I found it very interesting that the people on that list had so much of intelligence about every business on that list and what was some unique characteristics. So how can we bring this intelligence to the banks? Because very often the bank has to make a tough decision, a banking decision. But can it be made with more input? We could help them get there. And that we have a partnership. So if you know of any banks or you know the chair of a bank or anybody, please introduce us. We'll begin the conversation. I've reached out. The president of Drake Bank had come forward, and he introduced me to the Independent Community Bankers Association. And so we are having some conversations with them. But if you know of any of these kinds of groups, please, that's a good way to connect.
Now, Pat has some questions in chat. Are you able to access that, Dr. Corrie?
Yeah, I'm going to look at it.
He has 2 questions, actually.
ACLU, you mean? Yeah.
Yes. Pat,
Yeah,
do you want to ask them?
Yeah, I think that's why I just reached out to someone I know among credit unions, Matt Myers of Spire Credit Union, and asked him the same question. Is there a credit union network that I could connect with to talk about this idea? And about the census, yes, it's been very much in certain, we have not been actively involved with that, but there are others in the community that have been active around the census issue and accounting.
Okay. Santa Eric, did you have a question? Another one? I have a question about the demonstrations last May after the killing of George Floyd. Apparently, a lot of small businesses went out. The question is, how many are them going to return? How many of these businesses are going to return, rebuild, or are they lost?
Yeah, that's a tough one because a lot of businesses are getting hit even by COVID, and they were operating 25% capacity. I'm not sure what the next 4 weeks are going to do to them again. Yes, a lot of them that were destroyed. They have a student of mine I know owned one of the business on University Avenue, and it was completely lost. So that's a deep impact, and some of the funds that going towards them is helpful, but whether they'll be able to survive, it's a tough call.
Right. Do we have any other questions?
Yes. I live in St. Paul, but I have friends who have businesses in Minneapolis along Lake Street. what the hurdles that Minneapolis small businesses have to go through is so huge in comparison to what it is in St. Paul that several are giving up and saying they're going to go elsewhere. And that isn't just, it's really right down to the small things like the permits you need to clear your property or the permits you need to take down the buildings, the costs and fees that go into hiring people to remove things or where you're going to put the things. It's in really a microcosm. St. Paul seems to be sort of a one-stop shopping kind of approach. So how the regulations for business in Minneapolis is very, very different.
You're
Not
right.
a question, just a statement.
Okay.
No, you're right about that. Those soft kind of areas that don't give a lot of attention, even the amount of insurance that people cover. So those are all important things. And I guess the right policy response is to, as you suggested, unify everybody together so that there's a one-stop shop that can deal with all of this and give waivers or things that needed to get things moving.
Okay. Anyone else have any question they would like to ask the doctor?
I think
Dr. Corrie?
Suzanne has a question,
Suzanne?
or maybe that was a mistake.
Okay.
Mine's been answered, thanks.
Okay.
Okay. Well, if there's no more questions, maybe we should turn it over to you, Audrey, for our social hour. By the way, thanks again, Dr. Corrie, for not only your wonderful presentation, but also, yeah, right, that's going to be our new Humanist MN thing. But thanks for answering those questions so succinctly. I think we learned a lot. So, Audrey.